Nietzsche and the Übermensch, Becoming Who You Are. The enduring challenge of a radical thinker. The philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche stands as a towering and profoundly provocative challenge to the foundations of Western thought, morality, and culture. Writing in the late 19th century, he was a cultural diagnostician who foresaw the spiritual crisis of the coming age, a collapse of meaning rooted in the decline of traditional faith. His work is neither a neat system nor a comforting guide, but rather an explosive call to action, demanding that the individual confront reality without the solace of divine guarantees or objective truths. This philosophical project, at its core, revolves around a central revolutionary figure, the Übermensch or Overman, an ideal that remains perhaps the most misunderstood and yet most critical concept in his vast body of work. Defining the paradoxical command. The title of this narrative, Nietzsche and the Übermensch, Becoming Who You Are, captures the essential paradoxical core of Nietzsche's teaching. We are accustomed to hearing advice like find yourself or be yourself, suggesting an inherent static self waiting to be discovered. Nietzsche subverts this idea entirely. To become who you are implies that the self is not a being but a constant becoming, a work that must be actively and intentionally built. It is an acknowledgement that our present state is often a jumble of inherited values, societal pressures, and accidental drives, and true authenticity requires a dramatic, conscious creation of the self. The cultural crisis as the starting point. Nietzsche's entire project is predicated on his chilling pronouncement that God is dead. This was not a moment of celebration for him, but a somber recognition of a cultural catastrophe. The Christian God, as the ultimate source of value and meaning in the West, had lost its credibility in the face of scientific and rational enlightenment. The death of this divine anchor meant that the entire edifice of Western morality, purpose, and cosmic order was suddenly without foundation, resulting in a terrifying vacuum of meaning known as nihilism. The Übermensch is the answer to this void. The Übermensch as an earthly ideal. The term Übermensch, often mistranslated as Superman, is best understood as a beyond man or overman, a higher spiritual and psychological type. Crucially, this ideal is emphatically earthly and anti-metaphysical. It is not about ascending to heaven or achieving a supernatural state. It is about affirming and elevating this life, this world, and this body. The Übermensch rejects the notion of a true reality beyond the senses and instead commits wholly to the here and now, demanding that all value be rooted in human will and action on earth. A bridge, not a destination. Nietzsche introduces the Übermensch through the prophet Zarathustra, who proclaims that the Übermensch is the meaning of the earth, a goal for humanity to set for itself. It is a bridge from humanity to the Overman. This emphasis on the bridge metaphor highlights that the Übermensch is not a final, achievable destination, but a perpetual striving. The greatness lies not in the arrival, which is impossible in a world of constant change, but in the relentless, upward, self-directed momentum of becoming. The central role of self-overcoming. The path to the Übermensch is one of constant self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung. This is the continuous war the individual wages against their own inertia, their petty impulses, their fear of life, and their need for comfort. To become who you are requires rejecting the easy path of the herd, those who passively accept common opinions and seek safety above all else. It is a lonely, arduous ascent that demands immense psychological discipline and a willingness to break one's own cherished habits and beliefs. The creation of new values. In a world freed from God, the highest task of the Übermensch is to be a creator of values. This individual looks at the moral landscape and judges it, affirming what is life-enhancing and rejecting what is life-denying. They do not merely follow pre-existing moral commandments, whether from a sacred text or from society, but rather legislate new moral standards out of their own abundance of strength and health. This process is inherently artistic, as the individual shapes their life, their character, and their principles into a unique, powerful, and authentic expression of the will to power. The will to power and human drives. Underpinning the entire concept is Nietzsche's controversial notion of the will to power, which he saw as the fundamental motivating force of all life. This is not simple brute force or social ambition, but the drive to grow, to appropriate, to master, and to increase one's power and potential. The Übermensch channels this drive creatively, using it to harmonize their chaotic internal drives and passions, integrating them into a unified, focused, and powerful self, rather than letting them conflict or lead to self-destruction. The rejection of the last man. Nietzsche sharply contrasted the noble pursuit of the Übermensch with the pathetic comfort of the last man, a warning about the stagnation of modern society. The last man is the one who has tired of life, who avoids risk and challenge, and who contents himself with the shallowest form of happiness, safety, comfort, and mutual tolerance. By presenting this figure, Nietzsche underscores the danger of complacency and makes it clear that the ultimate failure is not in falling short of the ideal, but in ceasing to strive for anything grand at all. A philosophy of affirmation and greatness. Ultimately, the Übermensch is Nietzsche's poetic vision of human greatness and a profound philosophy of life affirmation. It calls upon us to embrace life in its entirety, not just the joys, but the inevitable suffering, the conflicts, and the absurdity, and to say an unequivocal yes to all of it, a concept he would later call Amor Fati, love of fate. The journey of becoming who you are is therefore the most significant ethical and existential project, the courageous artistic self-creation of a transcendent individual worthy of living in a world without gods. The death of God and the void of nihilism. The earth-shaking proclamation. Friedrich Nietzsche's most famous and consequential statement, the proclamation that God is dead, is often misunderstood as a simple act of atheistic celebration. In reality, it was a profound, almost terrifying diagnosis of the modern age. It did not signify Nietzsche's personal conviction that God did not exist, a question he deemed irrelevant, but rather the historical, cultural, and psychological fact that the belief in God had lost its compelling power, its authority to create and sustain morality and meaning for Western civilization. The institutions, values, and worldviews that had anchored humanity for millennia were beginning to crumble, leaving behind a spiritual vacuum that few recognized the gravity of. The murder committed by humanity. In Nietzsche's allegory, particularly in The Gay Science, the madman declares that we have murdered him. This act of matricide is crucial. God's death was not a natural event, but a collective deed committed by humanity itself through its relentless pursuit of scientific inquiry, rational critique, and historical analysis. The very intellectual spirit that defined the modern era, the love of truth and the drive to uncover reality, had ironically destroyed the foundational truth upon which it rested. This shared guilt makes the crisis exponentially more serious, as the consequences belong to us alone. The unforeseen consequence, the collapse of objective value. The death of God has a devastating logical consequence that Nietzsche was perhaps the first to fully grasp, the collapse of objective value. If God is the ultimate legislator, then all concepts of good and evil, right and wrong, and moral purpose were derived from that transcendent source. Once that source is gone, these values are exposed as mere human constructions, devoid of cosmic justification. Modern people continue to live by the old moral scripts, yet they had unknowingly pulled the carpet out from under their own feet, living in a world where their most cherished beliefs floated without an anchor. The descent into nihilism. The logical and emotional outcome of this realization is nihilism. Nietzsche defines nihilism as a state where the highest values devalue themselves. It is the profound sense that everything lacks meaning. When one discovers that the suffering of life cannot be justified by the promise of an afterlife, and that moral effort has no ultimate cosmic reward, the individual is paralyzed. Nihilism manifests as deep despair, a loss of purpose, and an inability to believe in anything beyond mere survival and transient pleasure. Active versus passive nihilism. Nietzsche distinguishes between two forms of this existential despair. Passive nihilism is the more common form, characterized by weariness, resignation, and quiet despair. This is the condition of the last man, the one who settles for comfort and small pleasures because he no longer dares to strive for anything great. Active nihilism, conversely, is the violent, destructive urge to tear down the remnants of the old world. While dangerous, Nietzsche saw a twisted form of strength in the active nihilist, for this individual still possesses the will to power to destroy, which could potentially be redirected toward creation. The danger of the European soul. The crisis of nihilism was, for Nietzsche, particularly acute in the European soul of his time. He observed a pervasive hypocrisy, people claiming to be Christians while acting as ruthless materialists, or proclaiming rationalism while still clinging to sentimental moral comforts. This widespread lack of honesty, this refusal to acknowledge the full terrifying implications of the death of God, was, in his view, more dangerous than nihilism itself, as it prevented the necessary creative response. The modern soul was sick, exhausted, and incapable of great aspiration. The task of enduring the wilderness. The task for those who truly understood the death of God was not immediate rejoicing but enduring a period of profound spiritual disorientation, a wilderness period. One must learn to walk without the crutch of transcendent belief, to look into the void of meaninglessness without flinching. This painful honesty is the precondition for true psychological health. One must fully acknowledge the magnitude of the loss before one can begin to build anew. The Übermensch is the one who successfully navigates and survives this existential desolation. The Übermensch as the creative solution. The concept of the Übermensch is therefore Nietzsche's prescription, the ultimate solution to the problem of nihilism. If humanity's values were destroyed, the only recourse is to create new ones. The Overman is the self-legislator who faces the truth of meaninglessness and, instead of succumbing to despair, affirms life so completely that he becomes the source of meaning himself. He is a meaning giver who infuses his own life, and potentially the lives of others, with a purpose born of personal will and strength. The responsibility for the future. The vacuum left by the dead god is not merely empty space, it is a space for responsibility. Nietzsche charges humanity with becoming worthy of the magnificent murder it has committed. The Übermensch is the individual who can shoulder this immense weight, who can look forward to a human future built entirely on self-determination and self-mastery. This future is one where humanity ceases to be a transitional creature reliant on external sources and instead becomes its own ultimate justification and goal. From passive man to active creator. In summary, the narrative arc of this chapter moves from a devastating cultural diagnosis to a revolutionary call for personal action. The death of God is the historical tragedy, nihilism is the psychological disease, and the Übermensch is the courageous antidote. It is the transition from the passive human, who receives meaning, to the active creator, who imposes meaning onto a chaotic, indifferent universe. The true journey of becoming who you are begins right here, in the cold, clear recognition that the sky is empty, and only the will on earth remains. The will to power. The fundamental driving force of existence. If the death of God presents the problem, then the will to power, will zur Macht, offers the creative engine for the Übermensch's solution. This concept is arguably the most misinterpreted in Nietzsche's philosophy. It is often crudely reduced to a mere desire for political domination or social cruelty. In reality, the will to power is Nietzsche's metaphysical hypothesis about the most elemental fundamental drive of all life, a pervasive cosmic principle that seeks not mere survival or happiness, but growth, overcoming, and self-enhancement. Every action, every thought, and every biological process, from the simplest cell to the most complex human aspiration, is fundamentally an expression of this will to exceed its current state. Beyond self-preservation, the urge to exceed. Nietzsche critiques the traditional philosophical emphasis on self-preservation, arguing that life is not defined by the passive act of maintaining equilibrium, but by the energetic, aggressive urge to constantly overcome it. The will to power is the inherent striving for mastery over one's environment and, crucially, over oneself. An organism doesn't just try to survive, it seeks to appropriate, to expand, and to integrate new elements into its being. For the human being, this manifests not as a physical hunger, but as a spiritual and intellectual hunger to become more capable, more profound, and more complete. The will to power as internal conflict. Within the human psyche, the will to power reveals itself as a turbulent, chaotic multiplicity of conflicting drives, impulses, and passions. We are not unified beings, we are a great polity of competing forces. One drive might seek comfort, while another demands great risk. One urges compassion, while another demands indifference. The struggle is to bring a measure of order and unity to this internal chaos. The Übermensch is not the one who suppresses these drives, but the one who channels and disciplines them, making them serve a single grand project of self-creation, much like a general directs an army. The aesthetic dimension, shaping the self. This channeling of internal forces gives the will to power its profoundly aesthetic dimension. The individual, in the image of the Übermensch, views their life and character as raw material, a piece of marble from which a magnificent sculpture must be carved. The will to power is the chisel and the hammer. It is the force that disciplines the formless into form. It demands that the individual impose their own style onto their character, shaping their passions and experiences not according to external moral rules, but according to an internal vision of strength and beauty. Creation, not domination. While the will to power certainly informs the desire for influence and status, its ultimate expression in the Übermensch is creation. The higher type seeks not to crush others, but to build something new art, new philosophies, new moralities, and most importantly, a new self. Domination over others is often merely a secondary symptom, frequently arising from a weakness that seeks external validation. True power for Nietzsche is the internal force to produce, to legislate, and to create values where none existed before. The drive against nihilism. In the wake of nihilism, the will to power acts as the sole antidote to existential paralysis. When all external meaning vanishes, the Overman's innate will to power becomes the internal source of justification for existence. Why live? The answer is found in the inherent non-rational urge to live more fully, to grow stronger, and to overcome the very despair of meaninglessness. It is a defiant yes to life, even when life offers no guarantees or cosmic comfort. Revaluation of all values. The will to power provides the impetus for the most difficult of Nietzsche's tasks, the revaluation of all values. The Übermensch utilizes this power to look critically at inherited slave moralities, systems built on fear, resentment, and weakness, and dismantle them. Values like humility and pity, often praised by the herd, are seen as expressions of a diminished will to power. The Übermensch replaces them with values that are life-affirming: courage, honesty, self-mastery, and the embrace of difficulty. This requires immense psychological strength and a ruthless honesty about human motives. Strength drawn from adversity. Crucially, the will to power thrives on adversity and resistance. A smooth, comfortable life is a life in stagnation, leading to the condition of the last man. The Übermensch actively seeks out challenges, contradictions, and suffering because these are the very things that necessitate and stimulate greater growth. Just as a muscle grows only by overcoming heavy resistance, the self-overcoming individual derives their strength and depth of character directly from engaging in a hard, demanding struggle against the limits imposed by nature and society. The eternal return as the ultimate test. The will to power finds its ultimate philosophical test in the thought of the eternal recurrence. Would you will to live this life, every pain, every triumph, every small detail, over and over again for eternity? Only the individual whose will to power has achieved a profound state of affirmation, who has shaped their life so beautifully and powerfully, can face this thought and say an unqualified yes. The power is not merely to endure the thought, but to love it, thereby demonstrating that the creation of the self has reached its highest degree of success. The engine of becoming. Ultimately, the will to power is the dynamic principle behind the commandment to become who you are. It is the non-stop engine that prevents the self from ever settling into a fixed identity. It ensures that the process is one of perpetual becoming, where the individual is constantly shattering and remaking themselves, striving always for a higher peak. The Overman is thus defined not by what he is, but by the magnificent, unrelenting force driving him toward his self-imposed ideal. The last man. The antithesis to the Übermensch, a warning. If the Übermensch represents Nietzsche's highest ideal, the individual who creates meaning and affirms life amidst nihilism, the last man, der letzte Mensch, serves as his most chilling cautionary figure. This character, introduced early and thus spoke Zarathustra, is the profound antithesis of the Overman, the exhausted, complacent human of modernity who has chosen comfort and triviality over striving and greatness. The last man is not simply mediocre, he represents a spiritual disease, a sign that humanity, having conquered nature, has turned its formidable energies inward to create a state of profound and contented harmlessness. The rejection of greatness and aspiration. The defining characteristic of the last man is his utter and complete aversion to any form of difficulty, risk, or great aspiration. Having witnessed the turbulent, painful, and often tragic failures of grand ideologies, religious zeal, and heroic endeavors, the last man has decided that the only sensible course is to shrink his desires. He seeks to minimize all sources of pain and maximize small, fleeting pleasures. He shuns any path that requires self-overcoming, internal conflict, or the creative legislation of new values, choosing instead the safety of what is known and comfortable. The cult of comfort and the denial of suffering. The last man has perfected the art of evasion, primarily through the systematic elimination of suffering. He views all pain, physical, psychological, or existential, as something to be immediately medicated, distracting himself with endless entertainment and superficial diversions. He has lost the Nietzschean insight that suffering is essential for growth, depth, and the creation of profound value. By rejecting tragedy, the last man simultaneously rejects the possibility of genuine triumph, leading a life that is shallow because it is utterly unearned and unchallenged. The spirit of the herd and conformity. The last man is intrinsically a herd animal. He cannot stand out, for fear of attracting adversity or the judgment of his peers. He takes shelter in the majority opinion, the prevailing morality, and the conventional wisdom. His opinions are never his own, but a carefully curated blend of safe, pre-approved sentiments that ensure social acceptance. This complete conformity acts as a protective shell against the loneliness and responsibility required for genuine self-creation, effectively murdering the self in favor of the collective, uninspired we. Intellectual exhaustion and superficiality. Intellectually, the last man is defined by his superficiality. He has inherited the knowledge that God is dead, but he refuses to wrestle with the existential implications. He is neither a deep thinker nor a true skeptic. He is merely exhausted by the effort of genuine inquiry. He prefers digestible soundbites, quick information, and popular truisms. The profound philosophical questions, the why of existence, are dismissed as unanswerable or simply too much trouble, allowing him to return swiftly to his comfortable routines and his tepid, unexamined happiness. The danger of universal sameness. Zarathustra warns that the greatest threat posed by the last man is not his wickedness, but his capacity to make everyone the same. The last man seeks to level humanity down to his own modest standard, mocking and undermining anyone who dares to strive for something higher. We invented happiness, he says, and this happiness is the tranquil, risk-free contentment of a well-fed sheep. This universal sameness threatens to become a terminal condition for the human species, ending the long arc of evolution and preventing the possibility of the Übermensch from ever emerging. The small desires and the narrow horizon. The desires of the last man are scaled down to match his tiny world. He seeks only material comfort, personal health, and a long life free of anxiety. He pursues wealth not for the power to create, but for the power to consume and remain protected. His horizons are narrow, limited to the immediate satisfaction of his creature comforts. He has no grand vision, no ultimate project, and no noble purpose that stretches beyond his own lifespan or even beyond his next meal. He has mastered the art of living a long, safe life, but he has failed utterly to live a meaningful one. The last man's morality of pity and weakness. The last man's morality is characterized by an excessive emphasis on pity and egalitarianism, not as expressions of genuine strength or goodwill, but as tools of control and reassurance. Pity is used to keep the less fortunate from becoming disruptive, and equality is championed to ensure no one rises above the average, which might make the last man feel uneasy or inadequate. His moral code is ultimately defensive, designed to protect his delicate peace and to cast the striving individual, the one who dares to be unequal, as arrogant or dangerous. The tragedy of lost potential. The true tragedy of the last man lies in his lost potential. He is the heir to the entire intellectual and artistic heritage of human history, yet he squanders it all in a passive search for contentment. He possesses the tools for creation and self-overcoming, the very tools that killed God, but he uses them only to build a more comfortable cage for himself. This descent into spiritual smallness is what causes Zarathustra to despair, seeing in the last man a future where the meaning of the earth has been betrayed by a species too tired to be great. A wake-up call for the striving soul. The figure of the last man is, therefore, a powerful and necessary wake-up call for the individual on the path of the Übermensch. He stands as a constant reminder of the tempting gravitational pull toward ease, safety, and mediocrity that permeates modern society. To become who you are, one must first recognize and ruthlessly reject the last man within oneself, to choose the painful uphill path of creation and self-overcoming over the seductive, downward slide into comfortable meaninglessness. The path of self-overcoming. The true meaning of becoming who you are. The paradoxical command to become who you are is the practical hinge connecting the chaotic reality of the death of God, Chapter 1, to the dynamic force of the will to power, Chapter 2. It is not a call for comfortable self-acceptance, but a demanding spiritual and psychological discipline. Nietzsche recognized that the human being as we presently exist is a mere draft, a bundle of conflicting impulses, inherited opinions, and cultural conditioning. The authentic self is not found beneath the rubble of society. It must be created through an unrelenting process of self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung. This path requires the individual to view their current self as an obstacle to be surpassed, not a treasure to be unearthed. The inner war against the inherited self. Self-overcoming begins with a declaration of war against the inherited self, the identity constructed by fear, convenience, and conformity. We are, Nietzsche argues, furthest from ourselves when we are most comfortably settled into societal roles. The task is to ruthlessly examine and deconstruct the moral and psychological structures we have passively accepted. This process involves confronting the spirit of gravity, the mental weights of traditional guilt, ressentiment, resentment, and the comfortable lie of objective morality. The individual must become their own prosecutor and judge, dismantling the parts of their character that seek to diminish life and evade responsibility. Asceticism and the discipline of suffering. The journey of self-overcoming requires a form of modern asceticism, though radically different from the religious denial of life. The Übermensch in training does not deny the body, but disciplines it. He does not shun passion, but masters it. This discipline is essential because it generates the strength necessary to create new values. One must deliberately seek out resistance and difficulty, understanding that growth is impossible without them. Suffering, in the Nietzschean context, is not a punishment but a crucible. It is the friction that sharpens the blade of the soul and reveals the true extent of one's inner power. The value of conflict and internal hierarchy. As established by the will to power, the self is a multiplicity of drives. The work of self-overcoming is to establish a hierarchy among these drives, ensuring that the highest, most life-affirming impulses, those dedicated to creation and aspiration, command the lower, reactive impulses like envy, fear, and revenge. This requires constant vigilance. The higher individual does not eliminate their passions, they harness their energy and sublimate them, transforming base metal into gold. The true master of himself is the one who can say yes to his most dangerous drives, precisely because he has learned how to control and direct their immense force towards a creative purpose. Honesty as the cardinal virtue. The primary tool for navigating the path of self-overcoming is radical honesty, Redlichkeit. The individual must achieve a piercing clarity about their own motivations, delusions, and weaknesses. This honesty is not comfortable. It involves seeing one's flaws without the mitigating excuses provided by religion or social custom. The Übermensch must be brutally truthful about the fact that many virtues, such as pity or excessive humility, are often masks for weakness and fear. This relentless truth-seeking, even when it leads to existential pain, is the most noble form of self-love and the foundation for all subsequent growth. The role of great health. Self-overcoming is inextricably linked to great health, a concept that goes beyond mere physical well-being. Great health is a spiritual robustness, a profound psychological resilience that allows the individual to absorb immense contradiction, tragedy, and chaos without collapsing into illness or cynicism. It is the capacity to endure the sheer complexity of existence and still possess an overflowing, affirmative spirit. The individual on this path actively cultivates this health by choosing challenging diets for the soul, demanding art, and difficult philosophy over the toxic triviality of the modern world. Dancing on the edge, balancing creation and destruction. The path is one of perpetual, unstable equilibrium. To overcome oneself requires both an act of destruction, breaking down old values and self-concepts, and an act of creation, building the new self. The individual must be flexible, capable of continually destroying what they have just built if it no longer serves their highest ideal. This spiritual flexibility, this ability to be both hammer and sculptor, judge and defendant, is the mark of the striving soul, always moving, always growing, always challenging its own highest truths. Rejecting finality and fixed identity. Crucially, the path of self-overcoming never ends. The moment the individual believes they have finally arrived or become who they are, they have failed and slipped back into the stagnation of the last man. The Übermensch exists only in the movement, in the continuous, striving dynamic of exceeding the self that was yesterday. Identity is never fixed. It is a process, a constant project. The goal is not to achieve a static state of being, but to master the art of perpetual becoming. The solitude of the high path. The act of self-overcoming necessitates solitude. To forge new values and define one's own path, the individual must step away from the noise and pressure of the herd. This solitude is not merely physical isolation but a deep psychological independence, the courage to think alone, judge alone, and be responsible for one's own truth. While painful and often misunderstood by society, this isolation is the fertile ground where the seeds of the Übermensch are sown and where the deepest layers of self-discovery and self-creation take place. A triumph of the will over accident. In its highest expression, the path of self-overcoming is the ultimate triumph of conscious will over the accident of birth and culture. It is the transformation of one's life from a random collection of events and influences into a unified, intentionally sculpted work of art. The individual, by rigorously applying their will to power to their own chaotic nature, transforms themselves from a mere product of their environment into an independent, self-directed force. This strenuous, noble effort is the essence of the becoming who you are, and the true measure of the Übermensch's potential. Creating one's own values. The necessity of self-legislation. The core activity of the Übermensch is not merely self-discipline or the attainment of power, but the courageous act of creating one's own values, a task Nietzsche termed self-legislation. Having fully absorbed the cultural earthquake of the death of God, The Overman recognizes that the old moral structures are hollow and that life offers no inherent, pre-written script. If values are no longer handed down from a divine realm, they must be generated from the most life-affirming source available, the sovereign will of the individual. This creative act transforms the person from a passive moral recipient into an active moral artist, shouldering the responsibility for defining what is good and bad for their own unique trajectory. The rejection of herd morality. The first step in creating one's own values is a definitive rejection of herd morality, the system of conventional, often unexamined, moral rules that govern the masses. Nietzsche argued that many traditional values, especially those emphasizing humility, selflessness, and pity, originated from a position of weakness and ressentiment, resentment, against those who were strong. These are values designed to manage and control the superior individual, dragging all souls down to the level of the lowest common denominator. The Übermensch must break free from this suffocating consensus, recognizing that adherence to the herd's dictates is an abdication of his highest potential. The freedom of the free spirit. To create new values requires the mind of a free spirit, an individual liberated from dogmatism and prejudice. This is a person capable of looking critically at every inherited belief and asking, does this value affirm life, growth, and the will to power, or does it diminish and deny them? The free spirit is not bound by any system, even Nietzsche's own, but remains perpetually open to the possibility that even their most cherished values may eventually need to be surpassed and destroyed. This intellectual fluidity is essential for a life dedicated to perpetual becoming. The value creator as destroyer. The act of creation is inseparable from the act of destruction. Before the Übermensch can lay down new moral laws for himself, he must first become a destroyer of tables, breaking the old tablets of moral law that no longer serve life. This destruction is an act of purification, clearing the ground of accumulated historical debris and moral hypocrisy. It requires immense spiritual hardness and a refusal to give in to sentimentality, as one must dismantle the very structures that previously provided comfort and social identity. Affirmation of life as the highest criterion. How does the Übermensch determine which values to create? The ultimate criterion is life affirmation. A value is deemed good if it maximizes the individual's potential for growth, power, creativity, and the passionate embrace of existence, including its pain and chaos. Conversely, a value is bad if it leads to stagnation, ressentiment, self-denial, or the flight from reality into metaphysical illusions. This means that the value system of the Overman is intensely personal and tailored to his unique nature, designed to allow him to fulfill his singular highest calling. The imposition of style. Creating one's own values is fundamentally about imposing style upon one's character. Just as a sculptor imposes form upon clay, the Übermensch imposes a coherent artistic design upon the chaotic bundle of their passions. They select certain drives for emphasis, courage, discipline, and subordinate others, fear, resentment, crafting a personal code that ensures internal harmony and directs all energy toward a singular magnificent goal. The life of the Übermensch is thus intended to be a beautifully coherent aesthetic spectacle, judged not by utility or happiness, but by its overall power and nobility of form. The weight of responsibility. This liberation from external morality comes with a crushing weight of responsibility. When the individual creates their own values, they alone are accountable for the consequences. There is no external authority, no God or society, to blame when the choices are wrong, or when the path leads to suffering. This profound self-reliance, this willingness to stand naked before the universe and own every decision, is what separates the strong value-creating spirit from the weak, value-following last man who seeks to dilute his guilt by merging with the herd. Values as a bridge, not a prison. For the Übermensch, values are not fixed, eternal laws but necessary bridges that guide the next stage of growth. They serve as temporary tools that enable higher striving. This means that the creative individual must be prepared, at any time, to outgrow and surpass their own current values. The highest form of self-overcoming is overcoming the self's most recent achievement. The Overman does not become imprisoned by his own creation, but remains free to continually redefine his moral compass in light of new experience and greater strength. The ethical goal, integrity and wholeness. The ethical goal of creating one's own values is not arbitrary hedonism, but the achievement of integrity and wholeness. By aligning one's actions and principles with one's deepest, most affirmed will to power, the Übermensch closes the gap between who they are and who they ought to be. This state of alignment provides a profound, non-sentimental self-satisfaction, a feeling of power and health that comes from being perfectly coordinated in one's purpose and action, living without internal contradiction or hypocrisy. The legacy of the lawgiver. In creating values, the Übermensch assumes the mantle of the lawgiver. While these values are initially personal, the powerful example of this life-affirming code can, and must, serve as a beacon for humanity's future. The Übermensch is the first fruit of a new harvest, showing humanity what is possible after nihilism. By successfully defining meaning through his own will, he provides a testament to the strength and creative potential of the human spirit, urging others to embark on their own perilous, necessary, and ultimately glorious journey of self-creation. The eternal recurrence. The most weighty thought. Among all of Nietzsche's philosophical thought experiments, the concept of the eternal recurrence, die ewige Wiederkehr, is arguably the most profound, the most terrifying, and the most crucial for understanding the Übermensch. It is not presented as a scientific theory or a prediction of cosmic physics, but as a thought of unimaginable weight, a litmus test for the individual's attitude toward life. Nietzsche proposes, what if, one day or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest solitude and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? The inescapable horror for the weak. For the last man, chapter 3, and the individual ruled by ressentiment, resentment, this thought is a paralyzing horror. The weak spirit, whose life is filled with regret, evasion, and unfulfilled potential, would recoil at the prospect of reliving their mediocrity and pain countless times. Every moment of wasted time, every cowardice, every self-betrayal would become an eternal, inescapable fixture. The eternal recurrence thus instantly distinguishes the life that is affirmed from the life that is endured. It is a judgment on the quality of one's consciousness and action in the here and now. The recurrence as a hyper-ethical imperative. The power of this idea lies in its transformation of every single moment into an eternal decision. If every action is destined to be repeated without end, then the value and quality of that action take on infinite significance. The eternal recurrence acts as a radical ethical principle, far surpassing conventional moral rules. It forces the individual to live with such conscious intensity and intention that they would will the return of every single second. It compels the question, is this moment, as I am living it, worthy of being lived eternally? The challenge to embrace necessity. The thought experiment demands the individual embrace necessity, the unwavering acceptance of everything that has transpired in one's life. The weak mind is constantly plagued by if only, or I wish I had. The Übermensch is the one who accepts their personal history, including all mistakes, failures, and suffering, as indispensable components of the person they have become. To will the recurrence is to sanctify one's entire past, recognizing that removing a single painful detail would unravel the complex tapestry of one's current existence and strength. The affirmation of the body and the earth. The eternal recurrence firmly anchors the individual to the physical world and to their own biological existence. Because there is no escape to a heavenly or metaphysical realm, the cycle happens only on earth and in the body. The Overman must learn to say yes to their entire earthly being. This affirmation directly challenges the dualistic traditions that taught contempt for the body and the physical world. The Übermensch affirms his passions, his desires, and his physical existence as the only reality worthy of infinite return. Transforming chance into destiny. In a chaotic world without divine order, the individual on the path of the Übermensch uses the will to power to transform chance into destiny. They don't just passively accept their fate, they actively love it and will it to be so, thereby retroactively imposing meaning onto the arbitrary events of the past. By consciously affirming the cycle, they transcend the feeling of being a victim of circumstance and become the author of their own self-willed eternity. The triumph over the spirit of revenge. One of the most profound psychological effects of the recurrence is the conquest of the spirit of revenge, the desire to punish the past for what it took away. The weak often yearn to undo past suffering or to change what is gone. The thought of eternal recurrence makes this yearning impossible and pointless. The Übermensch, by willing the return of the past, fully forgives and affirms it, thereby achieving a state of profound psychological closure and freedom from the crippling weight of regret. The ultimate act of value creation. When the Übermensch says yes to the eternal recurrence, this act becomes the ultimate single act of value creation. It is not just about creating a value, but about affirming the value of existence itself. By making a choice that lasts for eternity, the the individual establishes their life as the supreme value, justified only by the intensity of their own conscious will. It is a moment of total sovereignty, where the human being stands alone as the judge and justifier of their own existence. The ecstasy of the affirming soul. The Overman's reaction to the demon's whisper is not despair, but a moment of ecstatic, luminous affirmation. It is a triumphant, radical yes to the cycle. This joy is not irrational happiness, but the profound realization that one has lived a life so fully, so honestly, and so creatively that the thought of its infinite return brings no terror, but only intense, exhilarated conviction. This is the state of great health, the spiritual robustness required to face the ultimate test of meaning without flinching. The recurrence as the filter for the future. Ultimately, the eternal recurrence serves as a vital filter for the pursuit of the Übermensch. It is the invisible force that disciplines the will and clarifies intention. It forces the individual to live every subsequent day in such a way that they wish to relive it. It provides the necessary pressure to stop settling for the compromises of the last man and to start living a life worthy of the infinite, a life defined by courage, creation, and the unconditional love of one's self-made destiny. Amor Fati, the pinnacle of affirmation, love of fate. If the eternal recurrence, chapter 6, is the ultimate test of the soul, then Amor Fati, the Latin phrase meaning love of one's fate, is the Übermensch's victorious answer. It is the ultimate psychological and spiritual culmination of the will to power and the highest expression of life affirmation in Nietzsche's philosophy. Amor Fati is far more than mere acceptance or resignation. It is an active, enthusiastic embrace of necessity. It means not just enduring one's fate, but loving it so completely that one would literally wish nothing in the past or future to be otherwise. Transcending acceptance, the joyful yes. The weak or passive individual might reach a level of acceptance, a grudging acknowledgement of what cannot be changed. The Übermensch, however, moves beyond this entirely. Amor Fati demands a joyful celebratory yes to every element of existence. This includes the triumphs and the delights, but crucially, it also includes the suffering, the loss, the betrayals, and the moments of profound failure. This love transforms tragedy into beauty, seeing every necessary event as an indispensable ingredient in the recipe of one's own magnificent self. The necessity of the negative. Amor Fati forces a profound rethinking of suffering. The individual realizes that the struggles, the hardships, and the moments of deep pain were not obstacles to their greatness, but the very catalysts for it. Without the resistance, the self-overcoming, chapter 4, would have been impossible. To love one's fate is to recognize that one's strength, depth, and unique character were forged in the crucible of adversity. Therefore, wishing away the pain is equivalent to wishing away the self that has been so painstakingly created. The artist's perspective on life. The practice of Amor Fati turns life into an aesthetic project. The Übermensch views their life not as a series of moral dilemmas but as a work of art, a whole composition where even the dissonant notes and dark colors are essential to the overall masterpiece. Like a painter who would not remove a dark shadow crucial for contrast, the individual refuses to edit out the painful parts of their story. This perspective provides an ultimate sense of coherence, where every arbitrary event is integrated into a unified, self-willed destiny. The conquest of regret and the spirit of revenge. Psychologically, Amor Fati is the most powerful antidote to regret and the spirit of revenge. Regret is the futile desire to change the past, which is a form of passive denial of necessity. The spirit of revenge is the angry reaction to things that have hurt us. By loving his fate, the Overman conquers both, achieving a state of profound inner peace. He frees his will from the bondage of the past, fully affirming that it was necessary that it happened so, and thus directs all his energy toward creation in the present moment. Escaping the illusions of free will and guilt. The unconditional affirmation inherent in Amor Fati also allows the individual to escape the debilitating grip of traditional notions of guilt and absolute free will. While the Übermensch is responsible for creating their values and acting intentionally, Amor Fati embraces the deterministic reality of the universe. The strong soul is free not in the sense of being unbound by cause and effect, but in the sense of willingly embracing the causal chain that produced them. This realization dissolves the crippling anxiety of a false moral accountability and leads to a lighter, more exuberant way of existing. The profound rarity of Amor Fati. Nietzsche understood that achieving genuine Amor Fati is incredibly rare, the hallmark of the very highest type of individual. Most people are too afraid of their own shadows, too burdened by their past, or too resentful of their circumstances to achieve this unconditional love. This is why the doctrine is so closely tied to the Übermensch. It is the signature of a soul that has achieved complete psychological self-mastery and has successfully transformed the arbitrary nature of existence into a self-willed destiny. Living without reserve. The practical consequence of Amor Fati is a life lived without reserve. If one loves their fate and wishes for its return, as per the eternal recurrence, then one must live every day, every conversation, and every choice with the utmost seriousness, passion, and intentionality. There can be no half measures or compromises, as every moment is being eternally ratified by one's own will. This intensifies the experience of life, turning passive existence into active, conscious creation. The coincidence of the actual and the ideal. Amor Fati represents the perfect coincidence between the individual's actual life and their ideal life. The Übermensch, through continuous self-overcoming and value creation, aligns their character with their highest aspirations to such a degree that they could not imagine a better destiny for themselves. Their life in its full and terrible splendor has become exactly what they willed it to be, not through external luck, but through internal self-directed discipline. The ultimate freedom in necessity. In conclusion, Amor Fati is the philosophical paradox where the embrace of the greatest necessity leads to the profoundest freedom. By fully and joyfully embracing his fate, the necessary sequence of events that constitute his life, the Übermensch transcends the limitations of human suffering and regret. He achieves a state of powerful psychological autonomy, where his will harmonizes completely with the nature of existence. This unconditional yes to life, in all its darkness and light, is the sublime affirmation that crowns the long, hard journey of becoming who you are. The individual as artist. The self as an aesthetic creation. In Nietzsche's philosophy, the journey of the Übermensch culminates in the realization that the highest purpose of life is not a moral one, but an aesthetic one. The individual must consciously choose to view their existence, their character, and their destiny not as something dictated by fate or God, but as a piece of raw material to be shaped and sculpted. The Übermensch is thus the individual as artist, whose greatest masterpiece is his own life. This shift from a moral framework to an aesthetic one liberates the self from guilt and ressentiment, replacing them with the noble pursuit of beauty, coherence, and power. Imposing style upon chaos. The artist's primary task is to impose style upon the chaotic, contradictory, and often arbitrary nature of their internal drives, the will to power, and external circumstances. We are born as a multiplicity of impulses, but the higher individual acts as the unifying force, the great architect who brings harmony to discord. This is not about eliminating conflict, but about utilizing it, making the passions serve a singular, self-determined vision. The person who has achieved style is the one whose life displays a deliberate design, where every choice, every weakness, and every strength is integrated into a unified, visually powerful whole. The sculptor's hammer, discipline and refinement. The process of self-creation is arduous, akin to a sculptor working with unyielding marble. The will to power acts as the sculptor's hammer and chisel, rigorously cutting away the extraneous, the petty, and the weak. This requires intense discipline and spiritual hardness, a ruthless refusal to settle for the human, all too human traits of comfortable mediocrity. The artist must be willing to damage the current, flawed structure to realize the superior form latent within. Every act of self-overcoming, Chapter 4, is a precise blow of the chisel, refining the crude block of potential into the desired shape. Rejecting the pre-drawn blueprint. The conventional person lives by a pre-drawn blueprint provided by society, religion, or tradition. The individual as artist rejects this map. They must create their vision without a model, forging their values, Chapter 5, and their style based purely on their own deepest necessities and highest affirmations. This creative solitude is terrifying because there are no guarantees of success and no external critics to validate the work in progress. The artist lives by an internal conviction that his singular vision is correct, justifying his efforts solely by the grandeur of the final self-willed form. The aesthetic justification of the world. In Nietzsche's early work, he suggested that the only way to justify the suffering and chaos of the world is through an aesthetic lens. The Übermensch applies this idea to his own existence. He does not seek meaning that objectively exists, but rather creates a life that is so magnificent, so powerful in its affirmation, Amor Fati, that it justifies its own existence, including all its necessary pain. The value of his life is not measured by its happiness or morality, but by its sheer beauty and power as a completed artistic statement. Transcending the moral judgment. By framing life as art, the Übermensch effectively transcends conventional moral judgment. The artist is judged not by whether his creation is good or evil in a common sense, but by its mastery and its ability to compel admiration. The Overman seeks to live beyond good and evil, meaning his actions are judged according to the life-affirming code he has created for himself, not the weak, life-denying code of the herd. His virtues are those traits that contribute to the overall power and stylistic coherence of his self-masterpiece. The integration of contradictory elements. A great work of art is often characterized by the powerful integration of seemingly contradictory elements. The Übermensch integrates his own dark and light sides, his cruelty and his compassion, his solitude and his influence, his reason and his passion. He does not suppress the darker drives, but makes them serve the higher creative purpose. This wholeness, this capacity to contain and command a vast range of human experiences without hypocrisy, is a hallmark of the artistic self and a source of profound, non-sentimental self-satisfaction. The joy of the creator. The greatest reward of the individual as artist is the joy of the creator, a feeling of overflowing vitality and power that comes from successful self-legislation. This is a joy distinct from the shallow happiness of the lost man. It is the exhilarating feeling of having overcome resistance, of having impressed one's will onto the world and onto one's own nature. This feeling is self-justifying and is the highest internal confirmation that the life being lived is, indeed, worthy of the eternal recurrence. Leaving a lasting impression. The aesthetic project of the Übermensch is not merely a private affair, it leaves a lasting impression on the world. The Overman acts as a cultural force, a magnificent example of what a human can become when fully liberated and self-mastered. While he does not seek followers, his very existence serves as a beacon, inspiring those who are strong enough to grasp the possibility of a life lived without spiritual crutches. His self-creation is the promise of a higher future for humanity. Perpetual creation and the unfinished self. Finally, the artist knows that the work is never truly finished. The material of life is constantly changing, demanding continuous re-evaluation and adaptation. The individual as artist is perpetually engaged in a dialogue with his work, constantly prepared to shatter the previous form to allow for a greater, more refined one to emerge. The essence of the Übermensch is not the finished sculpture, but the magnificent, unrelenting act of creation itself, the eternal, joyful striving to become who you are through the sheer power and beauty of a self-designed destiny. Conclusion. The enduring significance of the Übermensch ideal. The journey from the death of God to the self-willed destiny of the Übermensch is not a historical footnote. It is Nietzsche's timeless blueprint for human excellence in an age of existential uncertainty. The Overman is not a tangible endpoint but an ideal, a perpetual horizon that compels us toward a higher form of life. This philosophical construction, articulated by Zarathustra, remains a defiant call to action against the spiritual complacency of modernity, urging every individual to participate in the difficult but rewarding task of becoming the meaning and justification for their own existence, rather than seeking solace in external systems. A synthesis of will and affirmation. The entire arc of the Nietzschean project is a powerful synthesis of two forces, the dynamic, chaotic energy of the will to power, Chapter 2, and the sublime, unconditional embrace of Amor Fati, Chapter 7. The will to power provides the hammer, the tireless internal drive to grow, master, and overcome the present self. Amor Fati provides the final joyous declaration that this entire striving, the pain, the effort, and the creation, is not only acceptable but is willed to be so for all eternity. The Übermensch is the unique individual in whom these two forces are perfectly aligned and mutually affirming. The triumph over nihilism and the lost man. The ultimate victory achieved by the Overman is the conquest of nihilism, Chapter 1, and the decisive rejection of the last man, Chapter 3. By creating his own values, Chapter 5, in a world without objective truth, the Übermensch successfully navigates the existential void and avoids the tempting descent into petty, safe, and mediocre contentment. His life is a living refutation of despair, a testament to the inexhaustible capacity of the human spirit to generate purpose from within itself, choosing the strenuous path of creation over the smooth slope of spiritual stagnation. The ethical imperative of self-creation. The ethic of the Übermensch is fundamentally an aesthetic imperative, to make of one's life a work of art, Chapter 8. This is the highest form of morality because it is the most honest and demanding. It calls for integrity, a wholeness achieved by aligning one's internal drives with external actions under a self-designed style. The individual is ethically bound to the task of self-overcoming, Chapter 4, compelled to refine, sculpt, and transcend their contingent self, thereby imposing an ordering will onto the chaos of existence. Responsibility and the weight of freedom. The freedom gained by the Übermensch is immense, yet it comes with a terrifying burden: absolute responsibility. Having rejected external authorities, the value creator is solely accountable for every choice and its consequence. This is the mark of true sovereignty. The Overman does not shirk from this weight, but embraces it as the necessary condition for greatness. This self-reliance transforms life from a passive endurance into a highly intentional, self-directed destiny, where failure is not a sin but a temporary setback in the continuous pursuit of mastery. The paradox of perpetual becoming. Nietzsche's philosophy emphasizes that the destination of becoming who you are is the movement itself. The Übermensch is not a fixed, complete state of being, but a restless, perpetual process of becoming. The moment the individual ceases the arduous task of self-overcoming, they risk falling back into the domain of the lost man. The true genius of the Overman lies in his spiritual flexibility, his willingness to constantly challenge, destroy, and transcend his previous highest achievement, forever pushing the boundaries of human potential. A challenge for the future of humanity. Nietzsche intended the Übermensch as a goal for all of humanity to strive toward, not a realistic description of contemporary individuals. He saw the Overman as a figure for the future, a promise that, despite the collapse of old values, a higher, more potent, and more self-affirmed human type is possible. The concept is a prophecy, challenging those with strong spirits to serve as a bridge, leading away from the exhausted herd mentality of the past and toward a more conscious, courageous, and creative human future. The personal and existential value. Beyond its cultural and historical significance, the value of the Übermensch concept is intensely personal and existential. It gives the individual a profound, life-affirming purpose, to live with such intensity and conviction that they would willingly embrace the eternal recurrence. Chapter 6. This thought experiment provides the motivation for every small, conscious act of self-improvement, demanding that one lives not for an afterlife, but for the magnificent eternal repetition of this life. The legacy of the lawgiver. Though the Übermensch is a solitary figure, their legacy is not isolation but inspiration. The powerful example of the lawgiver who created meaning out of chaos leaves an enduring impact. He is the symbol of humanity's deepest, most life-affirming impulses. His creation of a powerful, aesthetically coherent life demonstrates that meaning is always available, provided one has the courage to impose it. He is a silent teacher, showing us the path of self-mastery and the profound liberation that comes from owning one's own truth. The ultimate call to live dangerously. In final summation, Nietzsche's vision is a radical philosophy of courage. It is a final rousing command to live dangerously, not by seeking external peril, but by embracing the internal peril of radical self-honesty and self-creation. The Übermensch is the realization of the phrase, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." The whole point of the journey, the philosophy, the struggle, the value creation, and the Amor Fati, is to achieve a life that is truly, powerfully, and gloriously willed. The ultimate question remains: are you prepared to pay the price to become who you are?